It is a challenge when, like me, you teach courses that look at places and people operating outside a kind of more familiar Western kind of European context, students kind of getting the names right, spelling them right, pronouncing them correctly. It's always a challenge. So I think if they go away from a course that I've taught and they don't call, well, they call Chairman Mao by his correct name as opposed to Chairman Mayo, then I've done a great service. But anyway, I'm assuming that you can hear me because you kindly laughed at my attempt at a joke then. Can you hear me okay? Well, the subject of my talk today is Gandhi, someone whose name, whether we spell it correctly or not, I think, has acquired global resonance during his lifetime and which still resonates 65 years after his death. Gandhi's assassination in early 1948, less than 6 months after British India received its independence, sent shockwaves around the world. We think of Lady Diana, 15 years or so, dying, and the way in which that news spread. Gandhi's death shocked the world. The brutality of how he died contradicted very starkly the message of non-violence, of tolerance, preached by him. At the same time, Gandhi's come to be recognized by many commentators as a political thinker who recognized how the quotidian or everyday reality of modern life could be radicalized to produce the most extraordinary effects. In this sense, he was one of the great revolutionary figures of our time. Though his politics was directed along paths other than state building. The politics that he mobilized in practice required arguably as much sacrifice and even death as those propagated by his revolutionary peers, if for very different reasons, and his unsentimental engagement with the hard facts of imperial domination, fascism, and civil war effectively placed him at the center of modern history. So in the time available to me today, I'm going to focus on his reputation, on the one hand, seen sometimes as a sort of saintly individual, by others very much as a hard, pragmatic politician. And I'm going to try and think a little bit about how understanding both of these aspects to what he was help us to contextualize his role in the struggle for Indian freedom from colonial rule. We're all probably aware of the old cliche that India represented the jewel in Britain's imperial crown. So many of Britain's imperial interests by the beginning of the 20th century revolved around the control of British India, something that gave Britain access to power and to influence elsewhere in the world. When Britain, in a sense, lost India in 1947 after the Second World War, it was only a matter of time, as imperial historians have argued, before the rest of the empire would become independent. Thank you. Gandhi, born in 1869, this is a kind of very familiar image that we have of him, was the most, well, again, arguably, but I think a lot of people would agree, eminent individual associated with the nationalist struggle in India against British colonial rule. He's best known perhaps for his strategy of non-violent resistance, of non-cooperation, satyagraha, devised by him as a way of putting pressure, moral pressure, on the British that came to the fore after the First World War, when there was a huge spurt in support for the nationalist movement. By laying special emphasis on issues that cut across India's many caste, class, and religious divisions, Gandhi is regarded as having played a key role in mobilizing popular support for the nationalist movement, helping to turn the Indian National Congress from an elite institution, an institution representing elite Indian aspirations and aims, into a much more of a mass organization. In particular, large numbers of India's poor and illiterate people were able to relate to Gandhi, what he seemed to represent, and as a result, they were drawn increasingly to nationalist agitation. So Gandhi is one of those icons of the 20th century, one of those outstanding individual figures who made a major impression on events, who many people across the globe will be able to recognize, even if they're not quite sure why. We may not necessarily subscribe to the kind of great men theory of understanding history, but I think we do need to recognize the way in which individuals interact with particular political contexts at particular times, help to shape developments. And I think Gandhi's iconic significance is reflected in this cartoon that linked Gandhi to another 20th century icon, Mickey Mouse. This is, in a sense, the result of Gandhi's Congress colleague Sarojini Naidu nicknaming him affectionately in this way as sort of Mickey Mouse. People in Gandhi's lifetime, however, were never quite sure what to make of him, and working out exactly what Gandhi represents continues to pose a challenge today, a point illustrated by another cartoon of Gandhi, this time based on the well-known story of the blind men and the elephant. Quite obviously, as this cartoon suggests, different people have interpreted him in different ways, depending on the particular aspect of him or his work that they've encountered. And I suppose views on Gandhi can seem quite contradictory at times. Some people have regarded him as a saint, the great one, the Mahatma as he came to be known. One of the earliest biographies of Gandhi, written by the French pacifist Romain Rolland, published in 1924, emphasized his saintly, his spiritual qualities above all. Others, however, have regarded him as a consummate politician, clever, pragmatic, a skillful manipulator, a supreme organizer. Then there are other views, such as those of Winston Churchill, who could you put on to the next one, in the early 1930s dismissed Gandhi as a semi-naked fakir, a very sort of well-known sort of dismissive comment that Churchill made. Churchill, you should note, was never very enamored at the prospect of Indian independence. He was not prepared to endow a nationalist leader such as Gandhi with much credibility, despite the fact that, time and again, Gandhi proved his ability to mobilize Indians to challenge and resist the power of British imperialism. And if you put the next one. At times, however, Churchill's comments were perceptive. For instance, he observed, and this is just a quote from him, about the way in which what Gandhi wore had a political impact both in the way it challenged, or as he puts it here, insulted the British presence in India, but also the way in which it drew Indians to his cause. And I think one thing that we can be sure of is that Gandhi was a man of his time. Of course, the way that Gandhi looked, the way he dressed, as Churchill pointed out, perhaps reinforces the impression that Gandhi belonged to a traditional past, distant world. But we need to recognize that Gandhi's traditional appearance was no accident. He chose his clothes very, very carefully and deliberately to send out the message that Indians did not need to be westernized in order to be, I suppose, modern. Just as Indians could reject Western clothes, so they could claim their own independent identity, and with that, political independence. And in this period where, when you look around the sort of so-called non-Western world, what you see is clothing acquiring enormous political significance in places that were either struggling to obtain independence or to maintain their autonomy in face of growing pressure from the West. So what I suppose is very important is to identify the various strands that explain or help to explain who Gandhi was, what he represented. And there's no doubt that on the one hand, he saw himself involved on a spiritual quest. I think, time is a little, short, but just to sort of sum that up, his famous tactic of satyagraha drew heavily on religious symbolism. So he drew from Hindu notions of non-violence and duty. He was very heavily involved by the Jain religious tradition. He was also very influenced by Western philosophical and religious traditions, for example, by his reading of Christ's Sermon on the Mount. He was equally influenced by contemporary Western influences such as the writings of Tolstoy and Ruskin. They influenced his long-term efforts to disentangle Indian society from mainstream or the materialist, I suppose, clutches of Western civilization. And then there's this famous story some of you may have come across of when Gandhi was asked what he thought about Western civilization and replied that, quote, or words along the lines, it would be a very good idea were it ever to happen. So Gandhi's one of a small but influential group of Indians who encountered and experimented with Western ideas, thanks to the Western-style education that had become available there by the 19th century, something that was increasingly represented or believed to represent the passport to success under the British Raj. And mentioned earlier this evening, Gandhi trained as a barrister in London during the early 1890s, and during that period, as a result of his experiences in Britain, he started to shape his ideas about identity, and that's where they started to take shape, to crystallize. But then again, Gandhi traveled. He traveled from, to South Africa, as many of you will know. there. He spent decades. His outlook, his ideas were shaped, by his experiences that he acquired there. So if we just maybe move forward a little bit through the slides, just Indian indentured, if we could stop there. He returns to India during the First World War, begun thereafter to work for Indian independence, and realized that a big challenge was how to bring, while upper-class, Western-educated Indians were being drawn into the nationalist movement, one of the biggest challenges was how to bring in, ordinary Indians into the same struggle. And that's where dress came in very, very useful. And if we just flick through the next couple of photographs, what you see in a sort of nutshell is how Gandhi's own appearance changed over the years, where he went from, his West Indian origins through his time in London, shirt and tie, very much in evidence, and then moves on to South Africa, and where he starts to wear perhaps things that we're more familiar him seeing, and eventually back to India and then to the loincloth. Gandhi debated very long and hard about whether he should wear a loincloth. He knew it could be taken by critics as a sign of primitiveness or even indecency, yet for him it was a way of deliberately identifying with the poorest Indians. He insisted he wasn't trying to express any kind of saintliness, even though many people did identify this kind of clothing with the way that Hindu ascetics dressed. So in his view, the loincloth, wearing it was a rejection not only of the material products of the West, but also of its value system. But as I said earlier, Gandhi is also being regarded by some as, first and foremost, a politician, a consummate one at that. And you only have to look at his kind of sort of career, at the movements that he led, at the protests that he spearheaded, if there's such a word as that, to see how important he was as a politician as well. If we could just flick forward through and just see some more images of him and the sorts of mass movements that he was involved with after the First World War, the non-cooperation movement, his very famous march down to the sea in Western India to pick up salt, to challenge British authority, and then the Quit India movement during the Second World War, 1942. So, what conclusions should we draw, I suppose, about Gandhi and his role as a key leader in the modern world? Well, we can certainly say that he is someone who travelled far, both literally and metaphorically, from his early childhood days in Western India, via London, and then South Africa. He developed an outlook on life, religion, and politics that was very much the product of the range of influences and experiences that he encountered across 3 continents. So he was a man of the world. At a time when the nationalist movement in India was becoming more demanding, he devised effective ways of broadening its support basis, making it relevant to more and more Indians. And Gandhi's use of clothing to signal identity, in his case a very self-consciously Indian or certain kind of Indian identity in the context of British-controlled India, was no accident, but a very carefully thought-out strategy. And the apparent simplicity of Gandhi's clothing, however, shouldn't detract from the fact that his identity was based on this very complex mixture of factors that came together in very specific circumstances, the very specific circumstances of the late 19th century and then the first half of the 20th century. So Gandhi was a man of many parts as well as of his time. He understood both how the British Raj worked, he knew what made Indians, or at least a large proportion of them, tick. Armed with this knowledge, he made an indelible mark on Indian politics during the first half of the 20th century and arguably left a legacy that continues to, as I said right at the beginning, strike a chord globally. For instance, influencing, civil rights campaigns much later on, not just in the USA, but more recently in South Africa. So if we return to my original question about whether, it's right to see Gandhi as more of a saint, more of a politician, then the answer is I suppose we probably need to see him as both, but more, much more, as long as we are aware of the care required when defining these categories so as to take account of Gandhi's own particular vision or version of what in practice they meant. And I'll just leave you with the final image, which is not this one, not the next one, but the one after that, which is something I found on the internet, which perhaps is a little bit flippant, but I think just worth putting up because, well, some of us are familiar with action figures of this type, and if you just read what it has to say, I think whoever did this was really quite was quite clever under the circumstances. But thank you very much. Thank you.